This is the third in the craft room series, and we should get finished up in this video, at least with the major stuff. The last thing to do on the actual room was to paint the floor. We decided painting the floor would give us options in the future. Either area rugs or carpet tiles or putting down wood or putting down some other kind of tile. So we could just kind of get it cleaned up for now. Then I put up some baseboard. I made the baseboard out of the same plywood as the cleats, and I made them the same dimension as the cleats, so they look a little bit like just another cleat at the floor. And I pulled the tape up from painting the floor. We put the desks in that I made in the previous video. There's an entire video about making these desks, which I will link to. The smaller desk looks like it's covering the vent, and it does a little bit, but the way it hangs on the cleat, there's actually a little space between the wall and the desk, so there's room for the air to move through the vent. At our previous house, we didn't have a coat closet near the front door, so I had made basically an armoire, a freestanding closet to go in our entryway, which is what this is. And we haven't really needed it at this house, so it's moved around in different locations. We decided it would fit in this corner of the craft room. That's where we're going to move it now. And the idea is that at some point, maybe I'll make some shelves for it. The doors come off pretty easily. I've taken them off and put them on several times now as we've moved this around. So the hinges just have the hinge pin goes in, pops out. And I had installed, I think the first LED lights that I ever bought are in the ceiling of this. So it lights up on the inside. We wanted a bunch of bookshelves to hang on the French cleats. And my first idea was to make a shelf and have the structure under the shelf supporting it as it hung on the cleat. So I made one of these shelves. I carefully cut out all the pieces. I put a rabbet on the back of the shelf so the cleat would have a place to attach. And I made cutouts for the supports to attach to the underside of the shelf. And I made little support pieces that I actually had to cut a second time so they'd work. They weren't quite tall enough the first time. I cut a bunch of cleats as I needed them at this point for the various projects that were going onto the French cleat walls in the craft room. I glued all the parts for the shelf together and used nails to hold the glue in place. As I was building this, more and more in the back of my mind was the shelves that I had made for our pantry. And I had always hated how the structure got in the way of the things on the shelf below. And this barely fit. I still hadn't made the supports quite big enough, but it did go on. And at this point, it became very clear that this was just a dumb shelf. I really needed a completely different approach. So what I wondered about was, what if the support structure could be on the top of the shelf and help hold the books up, sort of like bookends built into the shelves. So the shelves are a little more like the desks that I made, where the structure is above and they hang off the cleat instead of being held up from below. So I made a bunch of brackets that would hold the shelf from above and would have the cleat along the top of the bracket. And with this, I used screws to hold everything together. These were a little quicker, a little dirtier, less trim. In fact, no trim. So I made 4 of these shelves, and I put finish on them. And I like the way these work much, much better. They work more like an open box that holds the books on the shelf. I had planned for the four of them to go in this location, and then I figured out that I stupidly put an electrical outlet on the second shelf, so it's going to have to slide over or go somewhere else. You can see how the books get held up and sit much nicer on these shelves. I made a version of this shelf that's not as wide, and I put 2 holes in the bottom. And the idea for this was that it could hold our scanner above the desk. So the holes are for wires and cables and all of that kind of stuff. It puts the scanner in a location that's very accessible, but it's not sitting on the desk. Another project, we have an old blackboard. It has 2 little metal hangers on the back, which I took off, and I added a cleat to the top of the blackboard. So this whole project is just adding the cleat. But now we can hang it in the room. So I will stick it here for now, but it may move around. Another thing that I wanted to make were some long, very narrow shelves to put framed pictures on. And I started with the idea that they would be 8-foot plywood shelves that are about 2 inches wide. I stopped and decided that probably wasn't the best idea, and I really should make shorter shelves and make them out of nicer wood, more like the desks. So if you remember this tree that I cut down with my friend Gabe and his father about a year ago, 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, but it's a red alder, and I took one of the cap pieces is what I would call it, but sort of the slabs that are at the outside of the cylinder of the log, and I sliced that up into strips. And I could make pieces for some very narrow shelves. So I jointed and cut and planed and got these down to the size that I wanted, and nice and straight and square. For being an old dead tree, it produced some really beautiful wood. I put a ravet in the back edge of the shelf for the cleat. Looking at it now, I should have cut the ravet on the CNC machine and not cut out the ends so that the ravet was hidden when you see it sitting on the wall. Just an idea for future reference. I have some old, big, odd-shaped bits that I've never had a chance to use. And I thought this would be a good time to use a 1-inch bullnose bit that I cut a slot into the top of the shelf so that if you put a framed picture in that slot, it'll sort of hold it on the shelf. And I rounded over a bunch of the parts to the shelf. There'll be a support underneath, which is what this is. And I rounded over the shelf itself. And I can attach the cleat, which I just did with screws. And I put a support piece next to the cleat. So as this shelf doesn't stick out very far, it doesn't need a whole lot of support under it either, as most of the force on the shelf will be directly down. And you can see how those work. And they can move around wherever they need to be. A few years ago, I built a big table for Calvin to use for his train set. And he got into trains for a while, but he's kind of gotten out of that, which I know is going to make some people sad, but he's moved on, and that's okay. What that means is we have this great big table that we thought would make a nice work table for the craft room. So we moved that into the craft room. I had sort of locked the slides in the shut position as we moved it with a screw. Most of the weight is the 1/2-inch plywood on the top, so I had pulled that off to make the table easier to move, and I can put that back on again. And since I had attached it with screws, it made it easy to remove and then replace. And I can put the drawers back in, and hopefully it'll make a nice work table and some more storage. I had tried to find a small extension cord reel to go in the craft room, and I couldn't find anything that was very little. Everything wants to be big. So I found this one, which I think is a little bit on the ugly side, or it doesn't really fit with the room. But if we use it, then the function will be worth it. So I bolted it into one of the ceiling studs, or floor joists, I guess, and we'll have an extension cord over the work table. And you can see why there are outlets in the ceiling now. This was the idea for those. Another project that we wanted to do was to build some storage shelving along the back wall. And the back wall being concrete, I didn't put any cleats on that wall. So I needed to build a more freestanding shelving system. And I've done this before, where I make basically a simple shelving system, but I make the shelves out of pieces of what would have been a flat shelf, but you cut those shelves into strips and then rotate them 90 degrees. So you get a deeper structural section for the shelf, and you get away with a little bit less material. With the prices of plywood these days, I was really trying to make a strong structure with as little plywood as possible. So I cut up the plywood that I needed. I cut up all of the scrap pieces, trying to find pieces within what was left over to make the strips that I was going to need. I needed a piece at the end of each shelf, and I put rabbits and dados in that to help space the cross pieces. And with 4 cross pieces, I could do the cut at each end and the 2 cuts in the middle just by rotating the piece. Thus, I only had a setup for the stop on the radial arm saw twice to make the 4 different cuts. And I cut the cross pieces, which are 32 inches, so I got 3 out of each 8-foot length. So you can see how the shelf goes together here. Then I glued and nailed the parts for each shelf. So there were 18 shelves. This actually went pretty fast. I started by doing one end, then rotating the shelf vertically and doing the other end. After a while, I figured out I could move the whole system to the floor and do the second end on the floor, and that was a little easier, as the top wasn't so high. Then I put finish on all of them. I think putting them together was faster than putting the finish on. This took a while. The first shelf I did, I put finish on every surface. Then I really quickly figured out that I really only needed to put finish on about half of the surfaces. So the top and the fronts. And the bottom and the back you'll never see. So I didn't bother putting finish on those parts. This sped up the finishing job considerably. And I brought all the parts into the craft room. I laid out the spacing for the shelves. I treated the ceiling like the underside of the next shelf for the spacing. So I ended up with about 14 inches from shelf to shelf, which gave me about 12 inches of height for storage on each shelf. Then I laid out the shelf to make sure the spacing looked right. That's always a good idea. Then I laid the shelves out on 2 vertical strips, and I could attach the shelves to that side.
So it might seem that just a little screw isn't enough to hold the shelf up, but the strength of this connection is both the shear in the screw, which is a lot. It's probably more than the strength of the wood. But the real structure here is the friction between the shelf and the vertical piece created by the clamping force of the screw. So that the screw is sort of holding the two pieces together really tightly, and that creates a lot of strength between the two pieces.
On most of the shelves, I used one screw, and I think on two of them I used two screws just to kind of help with the strength of the structure. Then I could start putting the different sections together. So I brought the first section over. It took me a minute to figure out that I had it upside down, and I had to rotate it around. In doing something where you're sort of moving big objects around, it's good to know where you're going to need the other parts and to make sure they're within arm's reach of where you're going to need them when you're going to need them. I've done these kinds of things so many times where I get it all set up, and then the post or the clip or the drill or whatever it is that I need is just out of arm's reach, and I can't let go of the big object I'm holding on to. So I have to put everything down and get everything set up. So it's good to kind of know what the operation is going to be and then have all of the parts in the right place. Then I can do the second bay. The first bay was the hardest, as the legs that I had to attach were free floating. Once I got to the second and third bay, it got easier as I just had to put the section I was attaching up against what I had already constructed. And by the third bay, I had the joints figured out a little better as well, where I wouldn't try and clamp a whole bunch of them with the spring clamps. I could really just clamp the one joint I was working on with my cantilever clamps and get everything lined up exactly how I wanted it, then put the screws in. I wanted to add a little bit of trim to the front face of the shelf structure that I just built. So I cut up one of the slabs of alder. This slab's in not the greatest shape. There's some termite damage at one end that I cut off, and it's a little soft in a few spots. I think I can find enough material to make the trim pieces that I want. This was doable on the bandsaw, but a little bit on the big side, so I just used the circular saw to do the first few big cuts. Once I had a piece cut off that I could work with, I jointed that and planed it and got it closer to something workable. I jointed the cut that I had made with the circular saw. Then I cut this piece into 4 strips. I rounded over the front face and I put finish on. And for being a somewhat rotted, little bit punky piece of wood, it's actually really beautiful. It has lots of character, as they say. And it has a nice contrast to the plywood. I cleaned up one of the ends of all of the pieces. Then I measured and cut them to length. I think they were all the same, and I cut one of them a little bit shorter, as the ceiling varies slightly. I put shims under the front of the shelf structure to sort of push the whole structure back against the back wall. Then I added some L brackets at the top. This will mostly just keep it from tipping over if there's an earthquake. I carefully cut off the shims. I cut down to where I wasn't cutting into the concrete. I was just making a big enough notch in the shim that I could break it off. Then I drilled a hole at the top and the bottom into the shelf structure, and I attached the new trim pieces from the back with a long screw. The trim isn't really structure, it's just there to look pretty. It just needs to be held well enough that it doesn't fall down. So it adds a little bit of weight to the structure. Then we could add the stuff that's going on the shelves. This is how the craft room is at the moment. The major projects are done. There's still a few little things that we want to do. There's talk of a cat run around the ceiling. That may be a future video. Also, I may build some simple pieces of plywood to go on a few of the shelves on the back storage unit, so we don't have to have containers on the shelves. We can have just objects that won't fall through the slats. Maybe some storage under the big work table would be nice. In fact, a place for the sewing machine to live would be perfect. And the wall that faces the basement shop room, we haven't really done anything with yet. I have a box shelf that I brought in from the shop that I don't really like, that I hung there, but that may go away, and we need to come up with something to go along that wall. Thanks for watching.